Hi, I'm Jacob,
I'm Sarah.
I'm Megan.
I'm Cassidy.
and we're doing a podcast based on the top 10 articles of the week for the News for the Real World Green page.
We're all freshman design and production majors at Carnegie Mellon University.
We love PTM.
So
Best major. All right, we're going to dive right into it here. So to start off, the first article we're going to talk about is about the vinyl production designer makes the HBO 70s set series Sing. It was written by Marge Gallus for Variety. Now, this article mainly dealt with the production designer of the TV show Vinyl and what he thought he needed to capture with the show. Now, the show itself was pretty boring, didn't do very well in the ratings, but the best part of the show was the production design. I think that the lengths that they went to recreate a 70s New York it was insane to me. And he thought, the production designer said himself, that the most important part of the show was to recreate like 70s era New York accurately. And the hardest part for him was that there's a lot of surviving stuff from New York from like the 20s, like the Art Deco period, but a lot of stuff in the 70s came down due to shoddy building, things like that. Things being it's easier to restore things from the 70s than it is to restore things from the 20s. So a lot of the stuff they had to do was on location or in sound stages or like inside, like in various clubs and stuff. And I think that, I mean, I know it's hard for you guys because you haven't watched the show, but I think that it was really important to them that it was messy and it felt like the youth movement and it felt like we were really getting the idea of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I think the production designer really accomplished it. Yeah.
Awesome. Very cool. Yeah, I haven't seen the show, but I've always been really interested in production design and like reading about like the design process, especially for television, because unlike theater, television is like you can pause it at any frame and see any discrepancy and be like, oh my god, look at this modern Doritos bag they had in the 70s show. Like, those kind of, yeah, like, the detail that needs to go into that kind of production design, because it can be rewatched over and over again. You can have time to, like, think about it and be like, that's not accurate.
Yeah.
I think is very impressive.
And then going off the detail thing, I know like we talk a lot about stuff here, like, oh, well, they're going to be sitting so far away. Will they notice this tiny speck of paint? But the reality is in TV, you don't know how close up the cinematographer is going to go. So it's sort of attention to detail is very important in that way.
Yeah, I also think like when we talked about kind of, there was a similar article about like production design, about the production design of The Bachelor on the on the blog, but it's a similar thing. And like it's kind of interesting because it's something that I haven't thought about, and it's different in theater because you're creating not only like you're creating a space that somebody has to recognize once a week for hopefully a very long time, rather than just like a space that somebody sits and looks at for 2 hours and then probably forgets, at least the details of it when they go home at the end of the night. So I think it's really interesting and something that, somebody becomes comfortable with, What was interesting, and I would imagine the same about this article, is that the woman who wrote the Bachelor article was very much like, I have to create a space where the audience feels comfortable and the people feel comfortable on set, and that it's also something that when somebody goes to bed that night or like turns the TV off, they're thinking about the details as well.
Yeah. Yeah, everyone thinks back to like their favorite sitcoms, like because we're talking about Vinyl, which is set in the 70s, I'm thinking of that 70s show. And like you just like, you see a screenshot of the basement set and like you immediately know, like I'm sure if you hadn't seen the show you wouldn't know, but it's so like iconic. Yeah, it's like television has this ability to be very iconic because of how accessible it is to general population. So it's like the detail that needs to go into that to like keep it going throughout seasons and maintain the space and like make it feel, because that basement is so iconic because that is my basement. Like that is a lot of people's basement, like just hanging out down with your friends on an old crappy couch, like that's nice.
Yeah, and I think
it's nice to feel like at home.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, like, an element of production to design. Like, we're talking a lot about, like, what it looks like, but also the props as well.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, at least in the case of vinyl, like, the guitars need to look, like, era-specific, because the people that are watching it want to feel immersed in the time period, and if such a minute detail isn't accomplished, then someone somewhere isn't going to be immersed in your show, and it's going to be a little bit less successful. And stuff like The Bachelor, if it's not what their target audience's picture of what that should be like is, then they're not going to be as immersed in it. So I think immersion is a really big deal. in shows like this, especially in a show like Vinyl. I don't know. I'm a fan.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. We're gonna move on now to our next article, which is from CartoonBrew.com. It's called Toonz software used by Studio Ghibli and Futurama being made free and open source, and it is by Amidi. I think is how you say it. And the article is basically about how a very popular animation program called Toonz with a Z was acquired by a Japanese animation company. It was originally an Italian company that owned the software. And it was used by Studio Ghibli. It was used by the creators of Futurama and other animated shows. And it was acquired by this Japanese company that made it free and open source to the public. It was made available on March 26th or 29th. And now it's available for download. And that's basically what the article said. Something that I really liked about this article, and by this, like, it being free now, is that I've always been really interested in animation, but it's very hard to, like, teach yourself how to animate. Like, you kind of can with Photoshop and other, like, programs like that, but learning how to use the types of programs used by professionals requires you to go get an animation degree, which makes sense, but for someone who's just interested in a novice level, it's very difficult to break into, and having this really high-tech program now available for artists and creators everywhere is a really big step, I think, in opening up the field a lot, because animation has always been a very closed-off field because it requires so much knowledge, and it's very, very competitive, and this kind of makes it a lot more accessible to more people.
One of the quotes I really liked from that article, I remember I wrote it down, was that the animation floodgates had opened, is what I wrote at the end, because like you were saying how like accessibility is a big part of it, is that like if you don't have access to this software, then it's harder for you to kind of break into the industry. So people who are better at just drawing, per se, might be able to kind of use this software to enable themselves to go to the next step almost, which I think is very important for at least being inclusive in this sort of way.
Yeah, I think in a similar vein, like, it's important to also make something like animation something that somebody can do not necessarily as a career. Like, I think we think about animation as something that, like, if you're going to learn how to do animation, like, it's a waste if you don't do it for your life. But it's still something that can be interesting, and it's still a form of art, and all forms of art, you know, can be done as hobbies and can be done as careers and blah, you know, whatever. So I think it's important to kind of open that up and allow people to see it as something that they can do just for their interest and not necessarily to make money or for their career.
Well, I mean, Studio Ghibli, I love Ponyo. I love Ponyo.
Who doesn't love Ponyo, though? What a good movie.
I would argue it's their worst movie.
What are you talking about? I love Fish Children.
Cassidy confirmed for Fish Child Lover.
I love
You
Fish
heard it
Children.
here first. But I also think Cassidy makes a really good point about animation being a hard field to break into. I mean, here at Carnegie Mellon, our curriculum encompasses a lot, and in our media Stagecraft class, we had to, like, work on animation software, and just, like, even the rudimentary stuff didn't come easy to pretty much anyone in the class. So I think that making these programs open source is a big step forward, and I think that saying the animation floodgates are open is a cool thing, but I also think that the barrier for entry is still really high. I think that just making the software available might not be enough.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like, I think it's a good step, but I don't think it's like, oh, yeah, like, now anyone can be animated. Something that I saw last year that's related, because it's animation, was that Pixar actually made a, like, Khan Academy, like, little class thing. It was aimed at children about learning animation. And it's aimed at children, and it's like, hey, you love these movies, you love these animated movies, here's how we make them. And it's like these little interactive, like, tutorials and stuff, and it's not like, here's how to use motion tracking software, but it's like, here's, like, the character development process, and here's kind of the, like, steps that we take, and it's more like showing than actually telling, but, like, that was, like, a really, like, big thing when it happened, because it was like, we get a peek into Pixar's process, and it's like, of course a kid would be interested in that. If Cars. Of course I want to know how the cars work.
Yeah, but Cars isn't good.
What?
I'm not a Cars fan.
We have to move on.
Okay.
Now that you've
Okay. Well, anyway, it's great because I think that step specifically was I think that stuff specifically with the Khan Academy class aimed at children is really great because it teaches it doesn't really teach it, well it does. It shows kids when they're still kids, like this is stuff you can do with your life. It's exposing more kids to education and it's
and art.
And it's free and it's on the internet, which is the most accessible thing in America. Like any kid can go to school and like go on a computer and learn about animation. It doesn't matter like where you are or how much access you have to these types of softwares regularly. If they're made free, you can teach yourself at least some of the skills and get a head start.
Yeah.
And open that gate. I think it's very important to do when you're young.
Yeah. Totally. All right. Well, Cars is the worst Pixar film. Moving on. The next article was "When There's Smoke, There's Stagecraft" by Laura Collins Hughes. This was in the New York Times, and this article talked about haze and the use of haze in 5 shows that are, pretty big on Broadway right now. The most important thing to take away from this article is that haze is really hard to pull off. Like, it's a really hard thing to get right. It's a really hard thing to manipulate. You don't just have to contend with the mood of the show, but you have to contend with the theater it takes place in, like HVAC systems and like the amount of people in the theater and things that you would never even consider to be an issue. But I also thought it was really interesting how every different designer like looked at the haze they were using. So there's a show called Eclipsed, which takes place in the wars over in Africa, and that was. The fog they were going for was like the fog of war, which is kind of like an amorphous idea, like war, like the fog of war, like we don't really see what happens because it's behind this wall of war. And I think using fog in a metaphorical sense is something really interesting, which is contrasted with the next thing, which is School of Rock, which is literally Haze the musical. Because
it was
when
Haze the movie too. Every time they walked on stage.
I haven't seen the movie.
That's really
No,
sad.
I'm not a Jack Black fan.
It doesn't matter. It's the best movie.
I also
Jack
don't
Black
like kids
is an
in movies.
American hero.
Okay, keep going. This is off topic.
Flash and trash is important to rock musicals, and no one's saying that it's not. And the next show that the article talked about was called The Way West, which just took place in a house. And the haze that they were talking about was literally just like the smoke coming off of the fire and how to make that feel realistic and immersive, which is so wildly different to how other people did. And then The Wildness, which was the next show they talked about, was again rock and roll, flashy. It was like a rock opera type thing. And what the Wildness lighting designer and School of Rock's lighting designer both said was they were most worried about overwhelming the audience. Yeah. Like the hardest thing to do when you're hazing is finding a balance between enough for the stage and enough for the audience. Because what might be enough for a designer to get the beams they want might be a little bit too much for audiences, and they might be like, is something going wrong? Because when there's too much haze, the first thing you think is like, the haze is broken. And then the final thing they talked about was the show Disaster, which is like a big, broad musical comedy that's supposed to be like disasters on stage, and that had like the smoky air of a casino and explosions happening on stage, and it had like meta commentary on how much haze there was. It would be like, there's so much smoke, and it was just like meta commentary. So haze can really suit whatever mood the designer wants, and that was what the article was getting at. That knowing how to use it is one of the most powerful tools in theater right now.
Well, I think here at Carnegie Mellon we get a lot of practice in using haze.
Don't I know it? Oh boy.
We use haze a lot in like every show. In fact, I went to a show this week and I walked in and I said, "Oh my gosh, there is so much haze."
I heard it.
I think that goes really well with the audience, like when there's too much haze for the audience, because every night during Plague, I walked back to the scene shop and
Plague?
there was
What's Plague?
Plague in Venice.
Plague in Venice at Carnegie Mellon.
And yeah, the same thing. Like the first thing I walked in, I was like, "Wow, there's a lot of haze." And like I think throughout the show, I didn't notice it as much, but walking in, like, don't start with the haze.
Yeah.
Like, introduce the haze later.
You don't want somebody to walk in and have that. I mean, the set of Plague in Venice and like the literal design is so beautiful, and instead of walking in and going like, "Oh my goodness, look at that beautiful picture on stage," I was like, "Oh my god, there's so much haze." Like, and that shouldn't be what people stop doing. That shouldn't be what people see or what somebody's first thought is walking into a space. It should be about what's on stage.
Remember also in the article there was like something you said about like you have to be conscious of who's backstage as well, which I think is important because you have a lot of people backstage, and if somebody who's way up like in the fly system is like being affected by all this haze, you have to realize you kind of have to cut back in terms of safety.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I think one of my favorite parts of Legally Blonde at Scotch and Soda was at the beginning of the musical number when it was like the beginning, the music hasn't really started yet, it hasn't really started playing yet. The hazers went on, and all you heard was, "Oh, Ward's."
Oh yeah.
And I was like, "Yeah, that was definitely the right time to do that."
Yeah. I also, Cassidy brought up something really interesting that they also spoke about in the article, which is, like, haze and house lights is really awful. Like, if there is a way to, like, haze during the prelude or the overture just to make it so that it's a little bit less clear that, like, there's haze in the space right when you walk in, it's cleaner on the designer's part and it's cleaner on the whole show's part. So, yeah, that's pretty much it for haze.
Cool. Next up.
Okay. So, our next article is The Empty Spaces, which was written by, it was called The Empty Spaces or How Theater Failed by Mike Daisy, and it was published on a website called The Stranger, and this article was very depressing, just to open up with that. He started with this anecdote about how he went back to visit a friend who he used to work with in theater, was asking about how her life was going, and she said now that she's 40, she can't support her life in theater anymore. And then he kind of delved into why, and a lot of this was to do with how theater has become so commercialized, and kind of like I'll go through the different ways that he talked about it. So the first was with this woman who could no longer justify theater with a day job because she would have to work so hard because actors are paid so little because it makes more money overall for the company or corporation. He also talked about the design aspect of things, how regional theaters are hard to sustain because they'll ship in a designer from New York, which is a lot easier than having somebody there who they have to salary and constantly support. And they also kind of talked about how theater has become so expensive it's viewed as a luxury item, which really helps the whole corporation thing, but doesn't help the community of theater as a whole. And this has caused audiences to age a lot. So he said that when he was younger, there was deals like 20 and under, half off tickets, and now it's gone up to 35 and under, half off tickets, which is a little bit ridiculous. And that sort of theater has become a lot more elitist and it's become a lot more corporate, and in those two ways has become stronger for people who are in arts administration, but has become weaker for the artists themselves. I think that's basically a summary of what he said.
I commented on this article, and my whole comment was like, this is really sad. And it was really sad. Like, and it's also, and I said this in my comment, like, if you go into a career in the arts, if you want to be an actor or a designer or whatever, basically, unless you want to go into, like, producing or something that, is relatively guaranteed to make you a steady salary, you know that you're going into a career that isn't necessarily stable, and one where you're going to have great years and one where you're going to have really bad years. And I think, like, making that choice is something that you have a big discussion about. I wrote about in my comment that, like, when I decided to go to college for theater, my parents and I sat down and had a conversation about, like, the reality of making that choice. And I understand that I'm younger than 40 and that life changes. But I also think that, as much as theater as a business has changed a lot, and that we should start to change it back and make it, a more profitable career for actors and a way of life, and rather than something that has to be considered a hobby unless you're an A-list celebrity, it is important to recognize that this, like, profession has never been stable, and you have to go into it knowing that, you're doing it, but, like, this is your life, and you've made that choice. So.
I also read this article and commented on it. I was pulling up my comment. And what really stuck out to me about this article was the anecdote that he was sharing about his friend when she was saying that she was tired of eating. The reason why she had, like, wanted to drop theater was because she was tired of eating rice every night for a month. And I think that that's, like, less of, like, a singular anecdote and more of an indictment of, like, the American theater system, because audiences are so attuned to spectacle from theater that I feel like we as a theater-going culture have, in recent years, I mean, we're starting to buck away from it with, like, devised theater, but we've become so obsessed with spectacle and seeing Broadway tours and that Broadway level of things that that's what we want to spend money on. So I think that the smaller, like, garage-style shows aren't as popular, so they're not making money, and as such, people aren't being paid, and people are becoming disenthused with the whole concept of theater unless you're big enough to make it on Broadway. So I think that for this to be fixed, it needs to be less of dedication and more of a public rethinking of what theater in 2016 means.
I think something you really just reminded me of was that the idea of spectacle is that people who go to Broadway are still seeing shows like Lion King and Phantom, like these over-the-top musicals. But I was thinking, what Broadway shows have I seen that have been minimal? And the first thing that came to my mind was Elephant Man, but that had Bradley Cooper in it. And the reality is that, like, to do a show that's that minimal, and not even minimal, but like,
a big
need
name
a spectacle
of
of Bradley Cooper. And like, not that Bradley Cooper wasn't amazing, because I thought he was amazing. But it's just like,
Bradley Cooper.
Yeah, I mean, shows like Curious Incident didn't have many big actors in it, but like it was one of the most like technically amazing shows I've ever seen.
Absolutely.
You have to either have the spectacle of the show or the spectacle of an actor, or no one's gonna come to your show.
Yeah, and I totally I think everyone kind of does succumb to that in some kind of way, unless you're a hipster and a liar. Like you go see like a really technically beautiful and like spectacle show, and you're like, that was cool, that was really cool. And anyone who's like, oh, that was really commercial, I'm like, that was so cool. What are you talking about? I think it's bad that like this kind of spectacle and this kind of like way we think about theater is the way it is, because it's like Jacob said, like it's boxing smaller theaters out of the industry, which isn't good either. But I don't know how fast a public reimagining of the concept of theater is going to happen.
Me neither.
I'm thinking tomorrow.
All right.
Next up.
Okay, so now we're going to segue into a actually basically as equally depressing article. So the title of this article was called Midnight Rider Director Randall Miller Freed from Jail in Shock Ruling. So basically this is an update on a former case, and sort of to summarize what happened, during the shooting of this movie, the director, because of like a lack of oversight, a woman named Sarah Jones was killed because of carelessness, and he ended up being charged with involuntary manslaughter and trespassing. But he was supposed to be in jail for 2 years, and they ended up only letting him in for 1 year. And a lot of people were very angry about this because they felt like there was no justice for this woman. And I completely agree that it's kind of horrible that he was released so early for this, because safety is something that we really should not be overlooking, especially in an environment like this. And though there is sort of some good side to this, they have a new app that was created after this incident where people can anonymously report set safety issues, which I think is a very important thing, because sometimes you're afraid to report things because it's like, oh, well, what will the director say? Will I work again if I'm complaining about my conditions? And there are always people who will work in unsafe environments because they'll be so afraid to not lose their job. But an app like this is very important. But I do think it's not very good that they're not really cracking down on this and letting him go so early. He is on probation for 10 years, though, and can't work on any set. There were a few other people who were also charged in this case and had that same probation, but I just don't think that is a strong enough penalty.
I think that's interesting. I think consequences are definitely important in a situation like this. There's a recent film, Birdman, starring Michael Keaton, that took place...
I can't believe you're mentioning Birdman again.
Birdman. And the main plot, one of the main plot points of the movie is an actor is replaced by Edward Norton because a light falls on his head. And the light falls on his head because Michael Keaton made it happen. And I remember seeing the movie and like people were like gasping and they looked around at each other and like, this happens in theater. Like, oh my God, this is like a common thing. I think that it's not necessarily a trend. I think that set safety is very important, but I don't think that we see articles about people like things like this happening every day. I think this was a relatively speaking isolated incident. It's not a huge problem, but I do think that it doesn't help the public perception of like theater and how how shoddy things can be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that like theater is like overall much more dangerous than I would imagine people who don't work in theater realize. Like, just there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that can go wrong, and a lot of things hanging over your head that are a lot of pounds that can fall on you. And there are a lot of steps that get taken to prevent stuff like that from happening, but it's also really easy to become careless, and I agree that, you know, the steps taken to punish that guy are not, you know, not enough. But I do agree with you, Jacob, that I think that, like, it's a relatively isolated incident, and I also think that if it was happening more, there would be more done about it, you know? Like, the laws are in place. There's only so much you can do once the laws are in place, and nobody wants somebody to die on their watch. So I think that's
Not many
motive
people,
enough to
yeah.
be safe.
Yeah, I think this is just the worst case scenario of
Yeah.
I think set safety is always a problem because it's easy to be unsafe, but in our modern age, of how advanced our equipment is and how many safety precautions are taken, you have every opportunity to be safe. It's just a case of carelessness and it's a case of laziness, and it's bad, but I don't think many people are being killed daily on sets either.
Okay, so next up, we have what I learned from seeing a high school production of Les Mis, and it was on theproducersperspective.com. So the article was by this guy who owns a theater in New York City, and he goes to see a Jersey City public school production of Les Mis. I'm from Hoboken, New Jersey, which is just outside of Jersey City. I went to Jersey City public schools for my entire elementary school, middle school life. So I was really interested in the article. And basically the program is that for one show a year, the biggest public school facility invites all kids from Jersey City to audition, and then they cast all these kids and they do a show. And basically the guy who wrote the article says, I was expecting to kind of go in and be like, oh, it's a high school production. It was high school and middle school. But he was pleasantly surprised by the level of talent of the kids and the sophistication of the production and kind of the elegance and maturity with which it was handled. Which I can't say that I have ever felt from a high school production necessarily, but it doesn't illegitimize what he says about it. He also makes some really interesting points about kind of he says that diversity in theater won't be an issue in a decade, which is if Jersey City is the third most diverse city in the country. Mm-hmm. So I can understand how reading going to that show you might say diversity is not an issue, but I think it's good to take a step back from that and say okay, well, in this isolated case it's not, but in the world and in the country especially it is. So I think that there are a lot of things about this article that were great, and it was great publicity for the Jersey City public schools, and I was all about that. But I think that there were a lot of things that he said about kind of the process of making high school theater, and what was good about this show was kind of isolated.
I'm also from New Jersey, but from central Jersey, so not as close to Jersey City. And what you just said about diversity not being a problem really struck a chord with me because so my school during my senior year got changed into an arts magnet school because all the schools around us closed down their arts programs. And it also happened that our school district was 97% white and the other school districts around us were 97% not white. And I think it's very notable to say that yes, in Jersey City, diversity will not be a problem, but in central New Jersey right now, we struggled to get an African-American man to play Richie in our version of a chorus line. We had to get a kid who's never done theater to audition because the reality is in a lot of areas, the schools that minorities, people in a very minority populated area, they don't have arts programs anymore. And they have to audition to come to our school to even have an arts program. And I feel like making that gross generalization is kind of dangerous because a lot of people don't have access to those programs. And I think it also, this might be going a bit too deep into this, but if you look even at our program here at Carnegie Mellon, the sign production program is very primarily white because it is something that you have to come from a privileged area in some regard to even be exposed to technical theater. So I think that yes, it's true that we are going more diverse, but you have to consider the opportunities that some people will really never have.
Yeah.
And how far ahead some places are than others. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Speaking for me, I came from an arts magnet high school in upscale part of Florida. I mean, there are places around, it is a public school technically.
Yeah, same with my school.
But you have to audition to get in, and people from underprivileged areas could audition, but there's that exposure there and a difference in the communities. It's very hard to get an African American person who lives in a more down on the luck community to say I want to do art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that again, we keep talking about the public perception of theater and all that, and I think that this article is interesting for a place where high school theater is very important, but I think in areas where high school theater isn't important, theater needs to be more of a presence because it's not going to change unless the kids that are alive want it to change. You know, I think that we can really make change happen in that regard.
I think this is actually a good segue into the next article.
All right.
The next article. The next article is called "Survey Reveals Attitudes on Arts Education and Government Funding." There was no author listed. It was by Your Performance Partners on yourperformancepartners.com. So thank you, Your Performance Partners. And it was just a very simple article about a survey of 3,000 adults that were taken, asking questions like, do you think arts in K-12 education is important? How important do you think it is? Would you support a candidate who supports in more funding for arts education? Would you vote not for someone? Does it affect your vote? And what was found that 89% of the 3,000 people surveyed believe that arts were a very important part of a well-rounded education for young kids and also for high schoolers. 90% agreed that it was an important part of the education throughout the process, so not just when you're in elementary school, you learn how to paint, and then math and science. 57% of the people supported more government funding. I think it was specifically raising, like, there was like $1 for it's like 49 cents for every like student in the program or something being raised to like $1. So it's just like kind of doubles the amount of money being given to certain schools. 36% of the people, I thought this was interesting, 36% of the people who were surveyed said they would vote for someone who made this part of their platform and saying we need more funding for arts education. 35% said it wouldn't affect their vote, and 17% of people said they would actively vote against a candidate who did that, which is a smaller number. But still, it's terrible. Like, yeah, it's. But the majority of people supported it, like the vast majority of people supported it, which I find kind of strange because 90% of people agreed that it was very important to teach kids about art throughout their entire education, and then 17% of the people said they would not vote for a candidate who wanted to do that.
I think it has to do with maybe like increasing, or I think one thing I noticed about this article was it didn't say who these 3,000 adults were or where they're from. Yeah. But so these could be people who like maybe think that having the arts in school was like teaching the kids how to play the recorder, or like they could think, oh, we need like a full funding theater program. Like we don't really know what their definition of having the arts was. Yeah. But that kind of, I don't know, it kind of makes sense to me in a way because a lot of people are very protective of like, oh, increasing art support means I pay more taxes. Right. So I feel like that does depend on how they were told increasing, like what would it mean?
That's what I was going to say also, that people are very willing to like say that they support something until it means that they have to pay for supporting it. So I think that saying, do you think that X is important? A lot of people will say yes, because a lot of people know that, you know, arts is important, and that there are studies proven that show that kids that are exposed to art have, you know, better lives. But then you ask somebody to, you know, open their wallet, and they're like, no. So I think that that's really important to recognize too, and like we all fall victim to that a little bit. Like I'm all about supporting this thing, you know, I'm all about supporting this person's rights, but I don't want to give money to it on the street if somebody asks me about it unnecessarily all the time. Or so I think that but I do think it's important that when we do say that we support something, we follow up on it, and we're like, if we're actually going to support it, then we should.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what Megan brought up about how a lot of people don't necessarily, like, there's no real good empirical definition of what arts are. It reminds me, in my elementary school, we had, like, one class a week that was our, like, fine arts wheel. And we had, like, one day we had art, one day we had, like, music, and that's when we had to learn to play the recorder. And then one day we had, like, computers, and then one day we had PE. And it was, like, very strange, our arts wheel. And that was our fine arts wheel at our school. And I think that if it was me as a parent and my child came home and said, in my fine arts wheel class today in computers, this happened, then I as a parent would be a little bit skeptical as to like where necessarily my money was going.
That means that your money is going to the computers and not
to the art, right. So I think that if, I mean, it's...
Maybe they were doing that.
I made a website about turtles.
I made a drawing out of letters in Photoshop when I was in the 3rd grade.
That's insane.
That's art.
I did Kid Pix.
I loved Kid
Pix is the best program ever. Teach kid pics. But I think that like there's no good way to come up with an empirical definition of what art is. But I think that a standardized definition like for this study might have lended it some credence. I agree with you. But yeah, we move on now.
Yes.
Next up.
Me. Okay. So this article was called Our Shrinking Repertoire, and it was by Michael Feingold, and it was publicized on a website called Theater Mania. So a summary of this, just like to start things off, I did not like this article, but I will explain why. So he was talking about how he went to go see a play, which was considered a great play, and it wasn't a great production of it, and then goes to talk about a new play he saw that he thought was like pretty good. But the rest of the article seemed to be emphasizing that he didn't think people were doing enough of these so-called great plays, and that people were doing almost like the way I interpreted it was that people were doing too much new work and not talking about these great plays, which he talked about like Heartbreak House, and there were a couple others in there, that he didn't think people were doing justice to this old work, and that more people need to see this old work. Personally, I kind of disagree with him. I think maybe it was just the tone of the article came off as a little bit pretentious, and that he was emphasizing that old work is better work. And that probably wasn't the vibe he was going for, because at the end he did say, I'll talk about new plays that are great next week. But it's just sort of like, I don't think that you should bring down new plays while emphasizing old plays, because I think they both can be good.
Yeah, I have two problems with this article. At the beginning, the very first thing he says is, I went and saw a terrible play. He says that, he's like, just to not be rude, I won't name the theater company that did it, and I won't name what play it is. Then, in like 3 paragraphs, he starts talking about this other terrible show he saw, and he says it was at this company, and this was a show, and this was the year they did it, and I'm like, you're a liar! You are a liar! Don't even try and be not rude, because that's rude.
Yeah.
Well, it's a criticism, which is fine, but don't say you're not being rude and then be rude. So I didn't like that, Michael. My next thing was, I don't know if this is what he really meant, but this is definitely how it came off, was he kept talking about how nowadays, because he said that the great show that was produced badly was not the show's fault, it was the people who produced it, because he said people nowadays are told not to be great and to not strive to be great.
I don't think that's true.
So people don't try to be great, which is very confusing to me, because why would you want, because you can't do theater unless you want to do it, because you'll die. So
there's no money in it.
There's no money.
There's no
you have no life. You get no money. There's nothing that comes out of it besides your own personal satisfaction. So if you don't like doing it, you shouldn't do it.
Dropping out.
Bye.
We'll do the rest without you.
So, of course the people who are doing this play wanted it to be good. Like, there's no reason someone would do a play and, like, let's give this about 45% of our effort. So that implication that nowadays our generation, not even just, like, us, like, of humanity doesn't want to be great is dumb.
All right, I have opinions.
No, you walked away. My comment is, who the hell gets to decide what great theater is?
Yeah.
Like, who are you? I didn't like this one either. But I just was really frustrated by that, because I think that my biggest pet peeve when people talk about art is, like, they decide that they are, God, and they get to choose what is good art and what isn't, and, like, I get to choose what I like about art and what you don't, and what I think is a great play and what you don't. And the best thing about art is that it doesn't freaking matter if we agree, because who cares? Because it's interpretation. So I think that was my biggest problem.
Yeah, and something that I really liked about this, going off that, because I think people being praised for being critics is kind of dumb a lot of the time. At the end of the article, it says, Michael Feingold was twice won the George G. Nathan Award for Dramatic Criticism, most notably for this article, which is so stupid. And has twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism. Like, why do you get an award for criticizing something? Like, I mean, I get, like, the criticism is good in some cases, but, like, come on, man.
All right, I also have opinions. This article was also really confusing for me. His points were really muddled, and he was also saying, like, don't do so much new work, but stop doing old work badly.
Yeah.
He's like, I saw the importance of being earnest once, and nobody got it but me. I should direct and be every part. And it was just like, this guy was really pretentious and not really worth our time, and I don't want to talk about him
It
anymore.
was worth our time because we had a good time.
Yeah, we talked.
Yeah.
This was a good 5 minutes.
Good,
fun.
a solid 5 minutes of the podcast, not a solid article, not a solid man. He's a liquid man.
We don't know him.
All
This
right.
is one article.
Liquid man.
Oh yeah. No what?
You're next.
I
Next.
thought you said Meg. Okay, hi again. It's me. So this next article is called the 2014 to 2015 season. How many people saw new shows? Again, there was no author listed, but it was on SchubertTicketingBlog.com.
Like the Schubert Theater.
It was another statistic article. It was just kind of about Broadway's last season, 2014 and 2015, about how many people bought tickets. It was I wrote 7,000. I think that's supposed to be
700,000.
700. Yeah, that's a way different number. 700,000 tickets were purchased online at Broadway.com, or there was another. It was like Ticketmaster or something. Ticketmaster. Makes sense. And it kind of just looked at how many people bought like one ticket to see like one show, and how many people came back and saw repeated Broadway shows. And the demographics of that, like 75% of those 700,000 people that bought tickets at all only bought tickets to see one show. And we don't technically know that because maybe someone else bought a ticket for them, but like that's the general number. 25% of people bought more tickets, and on average about 3.5 shows. I don't know how you say half of a show, but it was average. And the interesting thing about the article for me was that of the 25% of people that bought repeated shows, the majority of those people were not local. They were from out of town, but the 75% of people who have continued access to Broadway in terms of just like space, like they can just go easier, only bought one ticket, which was really actually surprising to me because I would think if I lived in New York, I would try and go see a lot of shows if I could. And if I live in upstate New York, which is 6 hours away, and I've only seen like 2 Broadway shows because it's like going there and getting a hotel room and like doing all this stuff. So it kind of was surprising to me that the majority of people who saw multiple shows were actually not from New York.
Well, sorry. Well, as somebody who's been like, I live like right in New York basically, and so like I have been to a lot of shows, but a lot of the shows that I've been to were like through Student Rush or through like something where I only had to pay like $30 for a ticket. And I remember my family, I would say, like goes to a show probably like once a year. Like that was it, that statistic is pretty much my family. If that, we haven't gone in a long time because it got more expensive and the economy tanked. So, but like I think is another thing to think about, that like when you're from out of town and not like upstate New York out of town, like actually out of town, and you come to New York, you want to get the full New York experience, and that means going to 3 shows or going to 2 and then coming back in 6 months or whatever. And also, that's to say, if you're coming to New York for vacation, you probably have a decent amount of money. I mean, New York's an expensive vacation spot, and so you're probably gonna splurge on tickets, and this is probably your vacation for the next 5 years or 10 years or something like that, and that means that you're buying your family of 4 tickets to 3 Broadway shows. So as much as it kind of doesn't like, I can't imagine going to see 3 Broadway shows at actual price in 1 year because it's so much money. But I guess if you're going, when I think about going somewhere else, you want the full experience, and that's part of it.
I think that one thing that stood out to me the most in this article was talking about the new shows and how that a lot of people who go to see new shows in New York don't go see new shows. And that's like they go see Wicked, they go see Lion King, they go see Phantom, like all these big musicals that we all know and like have heard of. And I remember that things that used to annoy me because like I live like an hour and a half out of a city, so it's like a little bit of a trip. But if I go, like I could buy tickets to go see a show and then go see it. So I've seen like a decent amount of shows, but like a lot of my friends who have seen a show, only one Broadway show, it's always either Lion King or Wicked. Consistently, it's been one of the 2.
Or Phantom.
And like people
Spooky.
Oh my gosh. People don't go see.
Sorry.
People don't go to the city to go see shows like Eclipsed, for example.
No, they don't. You're right.
Unless
Low
people
ticket
live-
sales.
Unless they are like a theater person. Like the 2 Broadway shows I've seen were Book of Mormon.
Me too.
It was a good show.
It was a great show.
Original cast.
Oh, original.
CMU,
Josh Gad, Andrew
CMU.
Reynolds, CMU.
Royal Valley
No
was.
one cares.
Anyway,
Rory O'Malley, if you ever watch this, I'm very sorry.
No, we
Sorry,
love you.
Rory. You're killing it in Hamilton. Not a good show.
okay, we're not having a Hamilton debate too. And the other show I saw was when I interviewed to get in here, and it was Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder. And I have never
I
had.
love murder.
I
Stop.
have not had such a good experience at a show
I
as I
know.
ever had at that show. I loved that show. But I was a theater person, and I was like, I don't want to go see Wicked. My mom was like, let's go see Wicked. And I was like, no.
Yeah.
How dare you?
Megan brings up Eclipsed, and I think it's really interesting. The Eclipsed was like not a play that was on anyone's radar until Academy Award winner Lupita Nyong'o
Yeah.
signed on as the lead of the
True,
show.
true.
Coming back to her earlier
Spectacle.
point, spectacle. People want to see that show because of that, not necessarily because of the content.
Okay,
Once it's in you, you can't stop it.
all right. Last up is just about all of Hollywood might boycott Georgia if governor doesn't veto anti-gay bill. It was on Jezebel.com. So the law itself would allow places like homeless shelters and food pantries to deny service to LGBT plus people. So this article came out, I think, a few days before the vote happened or the governor was going to veto or not veto. And it happened that the governor vetoed the bill.
Yay.
Yay! And the reason that the governor vetoed the bill was because a ton of like A-list celebrities and artists and art companies and big production companies said, you know, if you pass this bill, we are going to basically pull everything that we have or own or all of our shows or everything out of your state.
It wasn't just the arts world too. A lot of other big
Yeah.
companies pulled out from
Right.
it too.
And this, so I think like the reason that we wanted to end with this article was kind of because it's been a little glum lately.
Yeah.
And a lot of this stuff has been happening in North Carolina. Talk of people pulling out, like Bruce Springsteen pulled out his concerts from North Carolina. They already passed the law. So I think there's obviously much more progress to be made there. But I think there's something that I took away from this law, from this article, having read it when I did read it, and now having read it again, knowing that the law was vetoed, is that, you know, there are a lot of people in the world who kind of feel that these laws are wrong and they don't speak up enough. And when they do speak up, stuff happens and stuff gets done. And in the case of North Carolina, all these people are speaking up now, but it's too late now. You know, the law is there. And if they had spoken up a few months ago, maybe it wouldn't be there in the case of Georgia. So I think that, you know, there's a lot to take away from this. But mostly just, you know, it's important for us to believe for us to know as members of the arts community how much kind of pull we have, and how I think we sometimes forget that we have that kind of pull, and that by pulling ourselves out of an entire state, we're making an incredible statement, and that we need to do that more. And, you know, not only that, the arts is a great place for LGBT plus people to kind of figure out how to express themselves, and they're a huge part of our community, and we need to start recognizing them for that and start doing something about it, because the country itself is not treating them with the right amount of respect, and they're a huge part of what we do.
I completely agree. I think some of the greatest artists of all time, like think about Freddie Mercury, for example.
Yeah.
Freddie Mercury, it was well spoken that he had AIDS, and Queen is one of the greatest bands of all time. That's indisputable. But a lot of people stopped seeing Queen and started seeing Freddie Mercury as a gay man.
Bisexual.
But you understand what I mean. So people started seeing Freddie Mercury for who he was, like his identity, as opposed to the artist that he was. And I think a lot of what happened with Freddie Mercury was because of the public image of him. And I think it's really important that we as artists, and anyone that cares about the arts, speaks up and says, it doesn't matter who you like or how you identify. If you're creating, then we need you in the world. And that's really important.
Yeah, I know that, especially for me and a lot of my friends who are a part of that community, it really was, especially like going back to like, there's like that stereotype of like the LGBT kids go to theater in high school, but it's so true. Like it is always been such a thriving, like loving and open community to me. Like and that like it's always been so welcoming and supportive that we forget just how important that can be for kids and how much like how they can see that because the arts community helped me this bill, this is maybe a way I can express myself. So I feel like that's a pretty powerful message to send out.
It's not the reason a lot of kids who are feeling ostracized, who are feeling different, who are feeling scared go to the arts is because it's open to them and it's teaching them how to express themselves in like positive and helpful and creative ways. And it's like that shouldn't be a joke. Like that shouldn't be something. It's like, oh well, I just won't go to a Bruce Springsteen concert. I don't care if he doesn't come to my state. Like it's not just Bruce Springsteen. It's like all art is a representation of people who are feeling marginalized, people who are feeling different. The pinnacle, the central thing of art is being different and knowing that you'll be accepted and finding your place.
Yeah.
And it's really important that we have the power to do that. Even us, little itty-bitty Carnegie Mellon students. Gotta put your fist up. All right. So that's it. We're done. That was our last article.
I'm Jacob.
I'm Sarah.
I'm Megan.
And I'm Cassidy.
And this has been the News from the Real World Top Articles of the Week.
Hey!
Thanks for watching, Bobby Finger.